As we continue looking at the first 7 verses of the 6th chapter of Romans, what happens to a Christian as it relates to sin? You can be sure your awareness of sin is awakened and your desire of sin is lessened. That is, when you're born again. Last time we began talking about our burial through baptism. New Testament baptism always has to be correct in its message. That message is a believer who professes faith, not an infant being dedicated. Number 2, New Testament baptism must be correct in its mode. In other words, how it's done. What is the correct mode in the New Testament? It is total immersion, not sprinkling. You ask, well, how did they ever start sprinkling in the first place? It just became a matter of convenience for the Roman Catholic Church when they started declaring that every member of the Roman Empire was a Christian. They would just sprinkle water on the troops as they went out. So they said, well, let's just make it more convenient. We'll just do it to babies when they're born. It never was anything that was taught or practiced by the early Christians in the church. Here's the reason why I say total immersion. Do you see that word, baptizo? That's the Greek word. It always means to plunge, to immerse, to dip. That's a Greek word. Now listen, you may be amazed, it was never a spiritual word to start with. It was a common word in the Greek language. For instance, when ladies went down to the river to wash their clothes, it was the same word. They baptized their clothes in the water. They immersed it. It was used very regularly. A fabric that was being dyed was soaked in the dye to change its color, and that word that was used, they would baptizo the fabric. It's even used in Greek literature of a soldier taking his sword and baptizing his sword into his enemy. Do you think he sprinkled the sword over his enemy? No, he immersed it. He plunged it into his enemy. That's what the word means in its basic meaning. You say, well then, when they were translating that word, why didn't they translate it correctly? There's an interesting historical footnote. I'm sure all of you know about this history. I'm not telling you anything new. Do you remember Mary, Queen of Scots? She had a son named James, who was James VI of Scotland. But in 1604, he became James I, King of England. James was a devout man, and he wanted the Bible to be translated into the common language of the sophisticated people, which was Elizabethan English. So in 1609, he commissioned 54 of the brightest English, Hebrew, and Greek scholars to translate the Bible into what we now call the King James Version. It took them 2 years to do it. Well, they were translating along and they came to the word baptizo. They were supposed to take Greek words and translate them into English. But when they came to that word, they said, uh-oh, we have a problem. If we translate the word as immerse, dip, plunge, we may be in trouble. King James has not been immersed. He was sprinkled in the Church of England. His mother, Mary, Queen of Scots, was sprinkled. We'd better not translate it as immerse. If we do that, we're saying King James was wrong, and King James' mother was wrong, and the whole Church of England is wrong, and the Roman Catholic Church is wrong. So what are we going to do? Well, they probably thought, let's just translate it sprinkle. But they didn't do that because there was a totally different word in Greek for sprinkle. They didn't want to translate it pour because there was a different Greek word that means to pour. If they translated it sprinkle or pour, anybody at that time who knew Greek would have laughed them out of the academic circles. So if you want to know the truth, they copped out. They didn't translate the word baptizo. They just transliterated it. They just made it into an English word, baptizo. Let's just make the word baptize. Did you know there was no English word baptize until the King James Bible was translated? Now we have that word, and we use it a lot, don't we? Baptism, baptize, Baptist. Truthfully, I'm kind of glad that they didn't translate it plunge, because if they had translated it plunge, my father would have been pastor at Faith Plunger Church. And I would have been youth pastor at Grant Avenue Plunger Church, not to mention all the first Plunger churches that he pastored and I was youth pastor at. We're going to have a plunging next week at 6 p.m. I think baptism sounds great. Just think about poor old John the Baptist. Wouldn't have been right to call him John the Dipper, would it? As long as you understand the true meaning of the word immerse, that's okay. Thank you, Lord, for what you're teaching us. And I pray that we would understand the importance of our obedience to you in baptism, and that we would also understand what baptism is and what it isn't. And I pray that we would use that knowledge to exercise obedience in our own life, and that we would then allow you to continue to work on our hearts and minds as we continue down this path together. In Jesus' name.
Open the eyes of the blind. Purify our hearts in your fire. Breathe in a sweet breath. Jesus, have